Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. The night it all started was like any other. A quiet Friday evening, the kind where the world outside our living room seemed to soften around the edges. She'd spent most of the day on her phone, catching up on work, or at least that's what she'd said when I glanced over her shoulder. Her face glowed under the soft lamplight, but she seemed distant, almost absorbed in her own world. I dismissed it at first. Who wasn't caught up in work these days? But as the hours ticked by, a nagging feeling pulled at me, something that started small and refused to settle. "I'll be back late tonight," she said, stuffing her phone into her bag and checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. She adjusted her lipstick, pulling her hair back into a casual but flawless bun, her gaze fixed on herself in a way that felt new and strange. "Just dinner with some friends," she added, her voice breezy, like we both didn't hear the emptiness in it. I wanted to brush it off as paranoia, chalk it up to some inexplicable insecurity that had no place in our marriage. But as she slipped into her coat, the memory of past weeks stirred, the late nights, the hushed conversations, the locked phone. Patterns I'd ignored at first, thinking they were just part of the ebb and flow of life. Yet that night, they felt like pieces of something larger, something I couldn't ignore anymore. I didn't say much as she left. Just a nod, maybe a forced smile. But the moment the door clicked shut, I felt something solidify inside me, a realization so clear it was almost tangible. I didn't want to believe it, yet I knew that I had to find out the truth. I reached for my phone and opened the tracking app I'd installed on hers weeks ago. It had been a last-minute decision, an experiment I told myself I'd never use, a safety net I hoped I'd never need. The app blinked to life, a small dot showing her location moving down the street. She was headed in the opposite direction of the restaurant district, toward the quiet neighborhoods, far from the places we normally went. My mind raced, filling the silence of our empty home with questions I didn't want to answer. But there was no turning back now. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the car, driving a few blocks behind her, far enough to remain unnoticed but close enough to keep track. Each stoplight she hit, each turn she took, I matched from a safe distance. She finally parked on a dimly lit street. I pulled over a block away, switching off my headlights, watching as she stepped out of the car, her figure just visible under the streetlight. Another car door opened, and a tall figure emerged, walking over to her with easy confidence. She smiled, no, she beamed, at him, the way she used to smile at me. They hugged, lingering a little too long, before he guided her toward his car. In that moment, I felt the full weight of betrayal settle over me. Every suspicion, every half-formed thought over the past few months crystallized in that single act. A knot formed in my throat as I watched, unable to pull my eyes away. Part of me wanted to rush over, to confront her right there in the middle of the street. But what good would it do? I could see in her face that she'd already crossed a line, one she'd chosen, one that had nothing to do with me. I couldn't force her back. This was her decision, her betrayal, her secret life I was only now uncovering. I sat in the car, frozen, my mind racing with thoughts of what had gone wrong. Was it something I'd missed? Had I somehow failed her, failed us? But as the shock settled, anger took its place, filling the hollow spaces she'd left behind. I drove home slowly, replaying the scene over and over. By the time I got back, I'd already made a plan. She thought she could hide this from me, that she could carry on with her double life and keep me in the dark. She didn't realize that I'd seen her true face, the side she'd kept hidden from me for who knows how long. I spent the next few weeks carefully, meticulously gathering evidence. If this was the path she'd chosen, then I would have my own way of handling it. Each late night, each unexplained absence, every whispered phone call became a stepping stone in the story I was building. I didn't know how it would end, but I knew that I couldn't simply sit by and let her tear down what we'd built without a word of resistance. Our life continued on the surface, just as it always had. We still had dinner together, exchanged small talk, laughed at each other's bad jokes. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. I'd learned to compartmentalize, to keep my feelings locked away while I went about my days. It was easier than I'd thought. Eventually, she noticed that I wasn't the same. I could see the way she looked at me, her gaze lingering a little too long, searching for some hint of what I knew. Maybe she sensed the shift, maybe she felt the absence of trust, the lack of warmth I could no longer muster. But she never asked, never tried to bridge the gap. I realized then that whatever we'd had was gone, and no amount of talking would bring it back. A month later, I had all I needed. Photographs, timestamps, receipts from dinners she'd shared with someone who wasn't me. I'd catalogued it all, assembling a dossier that left no room for doubt, no space for excuses. It was a kind of therapy, a way to make sense of the betrayal, to understand how deep it went and how much of myself I'd given to someone who'd never truly seen me. She came home late one night, her expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. I knew she expected me to be asleep, unaware of the life she led beyond our home. But I was ready, waiting in the living room, the folder lying on the coffee table between us like a ticking bomb. Her eyes widened when she saw it, her face paling as she realized what I'd uncovered. I didn't say anything at first, just watched as she reached for the folder, her hands trembling slightly. I could see the denial in her eyes, the words she was ready to throw at me, the apologies she hadn't even begun to consider. But I didn't need her explanations, her justifications. I didn't want them. All I wanted was for her to see the truth, the damage she'd done, and to know that there was no going back. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, until she finally looked up, her face ashen, her mouth opening to speak. But I held up a hand, stopping her. "You don't need to say anything," I said, my voice low, steady. "I know everything. Every lie, every excuse. It's all there." Her mouth closed, the words dying on her lips. She looked away, her gaze falling on the evidence of her betrayal, the proof of a life she thought she could keep hidden. "I hope it was worth it," I murmured, barely loud enough to break the silence. The days that followed were quiet, tense, like we were two strangers sharing the same air, both knowing exactly why we didn't dare break the silence. After that night, she seemed to float around the house, each step careful, her voice soft and restrained, as if testing the waters for some kind of forgiveness. But there was none left to give. I was done making sense of it. I was done waiting for explanations. I wanted her out, but more than that, I wanted her to feel every ounce of the hurt, the betrayal, the darkness she'd invited into our lives. I went through the motions of each day, going to work, coming home, pretending to look busy around her while we shared our final days in the same house. I didn't make the mistake of confronting her again. The truth was, I wasn't sure what I'd say, and I didn't need any more of her apologies or excuses. Words from her, at this point, were cheap. And yet, something inside me wanted her to understand the depth of what she'd done, not in any shallow, self-preserving way, but to really see it, to sit with it, and feel the coldness she'd wrapped around me like a cage. One morning, after she'd left for work, I pulled out the photos I'd taken. I spread them across the coffee table, each one capturing her with him, locked in moments that were once mine, moments I'd taken for granted. Each photo told a story, a world of secrets she'd built on the side. The images felt surreal, like they were of another couple entirely, a woman who looked like my wife but carried a different, darker light in her eyes. I gathered them up, sliding them into an envelope I'd labeled with her name, sealing it with the weight of finality. I set the envelope aside, knowing that it would serve as a bitter memento, something she couldn't escape from when she left. Part of me wanted to leave it on her pillow, to make sure she knew the life she'd destroyed. But I knew she'd already sensed it. She'd caught me looking at her differently, noticed my silence where there used to be laughter. It was time to move beyond reminders, I needed her out. And I was going to make sure she didn't come crawling back with remorse after she was gone. Over the next few days, I meticulously boxed up her things. I made sure everything was in order, each drawer and closet emptied, every sign of her packed away as though she'd never lived here. Her favorite novels, the little trinkets she'd collected from our travels, even the box of old photographs, all of it went into boxes, labeled with a detached precision I could only manage now that I'd numbed myself to it all. I wanted her absence to echo in the house, to be something she couldn't ignore when she returned. The day I set it all on the curb, neatly stacked, the realization hit me: she was truly gone, in every sense of the word. I had no intention of letting her back in, not in any form. I'd spent too much time in the shadows of her choices, trying to understand, to reason with myself why she'd done what she did. And the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. We were happy, or so I'd thought. We had built a life that, despite its ups and downs, was worth fighting for. But she'd taken the coward's route, the easy way out, thinking she could have the best of both worlds without consequences. That evening, when she finally came home, she stopped short in the doorway, her eyes going wide at the sight of the empty spaces, the barren shelves, the ghostly outlines of her things. She glanced around, her gaze settling on me, and for a moment, she seemed to search for something: anger, maybe, or hurt. But I'd drained myself of both. I was past that now, past the shouting and accusations. All that was left was the raw, quiet truth she couldn't escape. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper, almost broken. "Why did you do all this?" I didn't answer right away, just let the silence hang between us, letting her words linger, weighted by everything she'd already known. When I spoke, it was slow, deliberate. "You made your choice," I said, meeting her gaze with a calm she couldn't shake. "Now, I'm making mine." She opened her mouth to speak but seemed to falter, her face a strange mixture of sorrow and disbelief. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the quiet desperation that had set in as she realized that there was no going back. She'd dug her own grave, and now, it was finally sinking in. "I never meant. I didn't think it would go this far," she said, her voice wavering. A laugh escaped me, bitter and cold, a reflex I couldn't suppress. "Of course you didn't. You didn't think about much beyond your own world. You never thought about me, about us." She swallowed, her shoulders sagging as she realized there was no room left for excuses. Whatever illusions she'd held on to were crumbling, and for the first time, she had to face the reality she'd created. "Please," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Don't do this. Don't throw away everything we have." But her words rang hollow, meaningless against the ruins of what she'd destroyed. I shook my head, the finality in my expression enough to make her shrink back, as if she could already see herself disappearing from the life we'd built. "It's not me who threw it away," I replied, the words escaping like a quiet, bitter truth. "It was you. Every lie, every secret, this was your choice." Her gaze fell, and I watched as the weight of her actions finally sank in. There was no bargaining left, no pleas that could rewrite the past. I stood there, watching as she struggled to find something, anything, to hold on to, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and the consequences had finally caught up with her. "I need you to leave," I said, my voice steady, unyielding. "Take whatever you need. The rest is on the curb." She looked at me, her face ashen, realizing there was no fighting it. And for a brief moment, I almost felt a pang of sympathy. But it was fleeting, a shadow of the emotions that had once bound us, now reduced to an afterthought. She gathered her things, her movements slow and disjointed, as if each step was taking her further from the life she'd once known. As she walked out, I followed her to the door, watching as she loaded the boxes into her car. She cast one last look at the house, her eyes searching for something familiar, something she could hold on to. But there was nothing left to find. She'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and now, she had to face the emptiness she'd created. When she drove away, I felt the weight lift, the quiet relief that came with finally letting go. The silence that followed was comforting, a balm over the raw edges of my heart. I closed the door, taking a deep breath, feeling the calm settle over me. I'd let her go, and now, I was free. Back inside, I stood in the middle of the living room, taking in the empty spaces, the quiet that had once been filled with laughter and love. But I wasn't alone anymore. I was finally rid of the shadow she'd cast, the secrets she'd kept. The house was mine again, a sanctuary I could rebuild, piece by piece. It would take time, I knew, to heal, to mend the pieces of myself she'd broken. But for the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a freedom I hadn't known in years. I'd finally found the strength to let go, to move forward. And in that quiet moment, standing alone in my own home, I knew that I was ready to begin again. The first few days after she left were surreal. There was a stillness in the house that felt foreign, almost haunting, like a deep breath held too long. The shadows stretched longer in the late afternoons, reaching across the walls like memories that refused to fade. For years, every corner of this home had been ours, filled with signs of a life built together, her books on the shelves, photos of vacations lining the walls, her favorite mug resting by the sink. Now, it was just me, surrounded by relics of a shared life that no longer existed. The mornings felt particularly empty. I'd wake up early, instinctively reaching across the bed, only to be met with cold sheets. I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, allowing the quiet to wash over me, to numb the edges of the hurt. Eventually, I'd get up, make coffee, and sit by the kitchen window, watching the world outside as I nursed my mug, the silence punctuated by the occasional distant hum of a car or a bird calling from the trees. It was strange how quickly the routine settled in, how the absence became its own kind of company. I would go to work, focus on tasks with an intensity that surprised even me, and then come home to a house that had begun to feel more like a stranger each day. It was hard to know what to do with the free time that had once been spent with her, filling our evenings with laughter, dinners, even the small, quiet moments of shared silence. One evening, as I was clearing out the last of her things from the closet, I found a small, familiar box tucked in the back corner. It was dusty, a little worn around the edges, but I recognized it immediately. It was where we'd kept mementos from the early days of our relationship. I hesitated, fingers tracing the lid, memories swirling to the surface. Inside were concert tickets, movie stubs, the first photo we'd taken together. I picked up each item slowly, feeling the weight of them, of a time when everything was simple, easy. We'd been so young, so full of hope. There was a picture of us at the beach, arms slung around each other, laughing into the camera, sun-kissed and carefree. I'd taken that photo as a last-minute decision before the trip ended, capturing a moment I thought I'd hold on to forever. I'd kept it in my wallet for years, a reminder of the love that once seemed unbreakable. Now, as I looked at it, all I could see were shadows, the faint outlines of two people who no longer existed. I closed the box, setting it aside without a second thought. These things belonged to a version of us that was gone, a ghost of a life I couldn't cling to anymore. It hurt, but it was also freeing, like letting go of a weight I'd been carrying for too long. It was time to release the past, to make room for whatever came next, however uncertain it might be. One night, I decided to head out. It had been weeks since I'd done anything other than work and come home to this silent space. A few friends had invited me out a couple of times, sensing something had changed, but I'd turned them down each time. I wasn't ready then. But that night, I felt the urge to escape the quiet, to be surrounded by life and noise and movement again. I met up with a few friends at a local bar we used to go to occasionally. The familiar smell of stale beer and fried food hit me as I walked in, but it was comforting in a strange way. My friends greeted me warmly, slapping me on the back, welcoming me back to the world with easy smiles and a round of drinks. I could tell they sensed something was off, but they didn't press, just included me in their conversations, their laughter, allowing me to rejoin the flow of life at my own pace. At one point, a friend asked how things were going. I hesitated, then shrugged, offering a vague answer about needing a change, about things being different. He nodded, not pushing for details, just giving me a look that told me he understood more than I'd let on. It was comforting to know that they were there, ready to offer support without judgment, without probing into wounds that were still too raw. As the night wore on, I felt a strange lightness settle over me, a sense of possibility. The pain was still there, but it felt less suffocating, more manageable in the warmth of laughter and familiar faces. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope, reminder that life would go on, that I would go on. Back at home, the quiet felt different, less oppressive, almost welcoming. I settled into the armchair by the window, looking out at the moonlit street, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't known in weeks. The stillness was no longer a reminder of loss, but a space to rebuild, a canvas waiting for whatever came next. The next day, I started clearing out more of the house. I boxed up the old photos, the mementos, the things that were once ours, but had now become relics of a past I was ready to leave behind. I wasn't sure where I'd go from here or what the future would hold, but I knew that I had the strength to face it, to build something new, piece by piece. That evening, as I sat with a glass of whiskey, I felt a clarity I hadn't known in a long time. I wasn't ready to let go of everything, not yet. There were still memories, moments of happiness that I couldn't erase. But I knew that I could carry them with me without letting them weigh me down. I was ready to move forward, to take the first steps into a life I could finally call my own. As the weeks passed, I began to feel a quiet sense of freedom. I'd done my best to rebuild, to transform the house back into a space that felt like my own. I'd painted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and added new touches, hoping to leave no room for old memories. My life was slowly reshaping itself, and there was a comfort in the simple routines I'd carved out: morning coffee by the window, weekend hikes, late-night drives when the silence grew too heavy. I'd even managed to meet a few new people, grabbing coffee or drinks after work, enjoying brief conversations that never carried the weight of the past. But despite the changes, something lingered, a subtle ache I couldn't quite shake. No matter how much I tried to close off that part of myself, I was haunted by moments that surfaced in odd places: the way she used to laugh when we were at the beach, how she'd curl up on the couch with her favorite book. I'd see flashes of her in strangers, in the glint of sunlight on a familiar street, in the scent of her perfume that would catch me off guard in passing. It felt like she'd left an invisible fingerprint on my life, impossible to erase. One evening, as I was coming back from a late-night walk, I noticed an envelope lying on the doorstep, weighted down by a small stone. My name was scrawled on the front in a hurried, familiar handwriting. I recognized it immediately: hers. My heart sank, and for a moment, I wanted to leave it there, ignore whatever words she'd managed to send my way. But curiosity and the echo of old feelings got the better of me, and I picked it up, carrying it inside. Inside the envelope was a short note, written in a shaky hand. Asterisk, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, and I wouldn't blame you if you tossed this note without reading it. But I need you to know that I am so deeply sorry. For everything. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I can't bear the thought that I might leave this world without telling you that you were everything to me. You still are. I'm not asking for you back. I need you to know. Thank you for all the good memories, and for being someone I could never deserve. Asterisk. There was no signature, no details, just those few, broken lines. I sat there for a long time, staring at the note, the words blurring as a wave of emotions I'd thought I'd buried surged back. Anger, sorrow, regret, they all twisted inside me, leaving me hollow and uncertain. I had been moving on, I'd told myself that this was over, but the note reopened old wounds I wasn't ready to face. Why had she reached out now, after all this time? What was she hoping to accomplish? I tossed the note into a drawer, trying to shake off the weight of it. But that night, sleep wouldn't come. Her words circled in my mind, stirring up memories I'd tried so hard to bury. I finally fell into a restless sleep, only to wake hours later, the echo of her apology lingering like a dull ache. Over the next few days, I tried to push the note out of my mind, focusing on work, on rebuilding, on moving forward. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a finality in her words, a heaviness that left me uneasy. Against my better judgment, I decided to reach out, hoping to find closure, to put an end to whatever lingering guilt had settled between us. I sent her a message, brief and to the point, asking if she was all right, if there was something more she wanted to say. Days passed without a reply, and eventually, I accepted that the note was her final message, her way of clearing her conscience. I reminded myself that I'd already said goodbye, that I had no reason to let her back into my life, even in this small way. But then, one rainy afternoon, a call came. It was her sister, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone I barely recognized on the other end of the line. Her voice was shaky, barely more than a whisper as she broke the news. My ex-wife was gone. She'd passed away just a few days after leaving the note, slipping quietly from this world in a small apartment across town. I dropped the phone, numb with shock, her sister's words ringing in my ears. I felt like I was drowning, like the world had dropped away beneath me, leaving me suspended in a dark, empty space. It was a kind of grief I hadn't expected, a pain I hadn't anticipated. I thought I'd let go, that I'd moved on, but the weight of her loss settled over me like a shroud, a grief mixed with regrets I couldn't ignore. The following day, I went to her apartment. Her sister had asked if I wanted to come, to collect any last memories, to pay my respects. I hesitated but found myself drawn there, compelled to face the reality of her absence, to confront the ghost of what we once had. Her apartment was sparse, with only a few signs of her life scattered around, a half-finished painting by the window, a stack of novels by the bed. The air felt heavy, filled with an emptiness that pressed in on me, that reminded me of the silence that had grown between us in those final months. I looked around, feeling the weight of all the things we'd left unsaid, the love we'd let slip away. On her nightstand, I found a photograph of us, from years ago. We were smiling, arms around each other, a time when everything felt simple and unbreakable. I took the picture, holding it carefully, feeling the ache of a life we'd lost somewhere along the way. As I left her apartment, a strange calm settled over me. I had no answers, no neat ending, no closure. Only the bittersweet memories and the knowledge that she was gone, taking with her a piece of me I could never reclaim. I walked through the rain, the photo clutched in my hand, feeling a sadness deeper than any I'd ever known. In the days that followed, I returned to the quiet life I'd built, but it felt different now, like an echo of what it once was. Her memory lingered, filling the empty spaces of my home, my mind. I'd let her go in life, but now, in death, she remained, a haunting reminder of love lost and the fragile, fleeting nature of happiness. And in the stillness of each evening, as I sat by the window and looked out at the darkening street, I was left with the weight of knowing that some endings come without answers, without forgiveness, only the silent shadows of what might have been.